Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the Dervish class, which is the combination Nightblade Oathkeeper as requested by Big Pot Dragon. Now again, just to reiterate this for this particular series, this is more for your purposes of improv or building your own build, using this as a kind of a groundwork to construct your own build with. Give you some ideas for that, or ultimately if you just don't have the items you necessarily need, these are great directions that you can roughly follow to construct a better build or have a better time going through the game. Now, with the Dervish, there's actually a lot of people will look at the Nightblade Oathkeeper combination and see only a couple of the possibilities, but this actual combination has a lot of different little varieties that you can really work with. There's broadly 3 primary categories. You've got elemental, you have poison acid, you have vitality focus. You can go a whole bunch of different directions with this. And typically, again, which is pretty classic of the Nightblade, you can splash in a whole bunch of different damage types to really offset any kind of problems you may have with an enemy particularly resistant to any one damage type. So it has a lot of potential to deal with pretty much anything that comes your way, but the really special thing about the Dervish is that it can kind of fluctuate as you need between offense and defense. It really depends upon how you build, what skills you are using, and whether or not you're going with a shield or two melee weapons, dual wielding, what have you. Now I'm going to deal with the I'm going to go with actually the most complicated version here, which is the Elemental Dervish. Now, the interesting thing about an Elemental Dervish is that, first off, you're still going to have a pretty heavy emphasis on fire, because you're going to want to naturally go into Divine Mandate. But the catch here is that now you have a couple of decisions to specifically make. The first big decision you have to come down to is, am I going to use a shield? This matters, because this means, are you going to be having access to Aegis of Men here? Do you want Safeguard, which Safeguard is quite potent? You have to make this decision. Do you want to use Virus Might? Now, whether or not you use a shield should actually come down to 2 different questions, which are the big reasons you want to use a shield with the Dervish. Because as nice as a shield is, it does respectable damage, but it doesn't hit quite as hard as the dual wielding. So you have to come to these 2 questions. The first question you have to ask yourself is, am I working with allies? Am I working with other players? If the answer is yes, maybe you should think more seriously about using a shield, because you can play a very damaging tank with a Dervish by running Aegis of Men here, which, by the way, increases your threat level. Or actually, it specifically taunts, which is basically a stronger version of threat increase, which basically means you're going to get specifically targeted, which is what you want if you are playing a tank with allies. You're trying to pull enemy attention off of your allies. So you run Aegis of Men here, you go into Safeguard. Fantastic time. And then at this point you have a couple of options, but one thing I would very strenuously recommend is Pneumatic Burst all the way to Elemental Awakening. This increases your elemental damage, which is very important. This allows you to heal. You can combine this with Resilience for even more healing, and absolutely stack up your defenses. But at this point, then you've got a couple of different options. When I'm playing a tank Dervish, focusing on elemental damage, I will usually go in for Judgment, because I can taunt again, I can knock down enemies that are already bothering me, and I can do all kinds of fun things. I get extra retaliation damage, more on that in a hot second, and I also can make them die faster by reducing their defensive abilities. That's very nice. Furthermore, we can stack on top of that these, which especially Rebuke, which increases your retaliation damage. For reference, Reprisal adds retaliation damage, so you have a whole bunch of retaliation damage here. Now, this doesn't really focus on your auto attacks, really. This is primarily ability based. There is a variant here that you can pull, where instead of using Judgment, you are instead utilizing Righteous Fervor for that individual target damage. Alternatively, if you really want to, and this is possible to run. Instead of doing these, and you feel like you want to be a dual-wielding tank, you can do this. It's riskier because you don't have the benefit of the shield, but you can do a dual-wielding tank dervish with elemental damage. Instead of using the shield, you're running this and Judgment. At the very least, the first stage, however much past that, is entirely up to you, but at the very least you want to run Judgment here, because that will keep enemies closer to you. Now, besides the higher risk here, because again, you don't have the shield, so you don't have that defensive bonus, and frankly, you actually aren't going to be necessarily going up to here, because this boosts your shield block chance. If I'm not using a shield, I'm not usually going up to Haven. I'll usually stick with Presence of Virtue, and go all the way out here, because this is actually quite damaging, and Crushing Verdict can really be quite nice, especially with the dual wielding. But besides not having the shield to help keep you alive as a dual-wielding tank dervish, you've also got the mild problem of having a harder time taunting distant enemies, because Judgment is only 6 meters out from you. I mean, the area does increase, and it increases a decent amount, 10 meters, but that's still not quite as much as throwing your stinking shield, right? So if you have an ally in danger, and you need to taunt them, you have to run up on them. Now, there is the possibility, I've mentioned this earlier with the Nightblade before, but you could bust out Shadow Strike, just one point in that for that move speed, but you still have to use Shadow Strike and then use Judgment. There's animations to go through. It's not quite as nigh instantaneous as chucking your shield at them and taunting a whole slew of enemies all in one go. So there is a bit more risk here. It is possible, but I don't often go this direction because there just isn't enough ability to save allies in times of hideously extreme danger, which sometimes happens. But you can absolutely make this work. It's just, like I said, it's riskier, your retaliation damage isn't as high, you die a little faster, but it's something you can absolutely do. Now, another interesting little thing you can do, actually, is, and this doesn't actually occur to a lot of people, but you can put a point into Breath of Belgothian and run a dual-wielding Eye of Reckoning. Soulfire. You've got your Elemental Awakening here, which is increasing your cold damage. You run Veil of Shadow and Night's Chill, and now you're a Spin to Win with all 3 elements. With a self-heal, grab Phantasmal Armor if you're really nervous. And now, who's going to stop you? I mean, I don't know why I pulled out a point I had here, Resilience, but you would also want to run Resilience as well here. Probably Presence of Virtue. Whenever I'm going to do any kind of Spin to Win, I'm running Presence of Virtue almost all the time just for the energy regeneration. It's just the best response to that. But yeah, you want to Spin to Win with dual wielding? Go for it. It is absolutely, this can be quite potent if you have the right equipment. If you have the right weapons equipped, this could be very nice. But, that's a fairly interesting time, especially since, once you get into melee range, the Night's Chill, yeah, you're not really taking advantage of the Poison Acid resistance, which is a mild downside, but really you're building Night's Chill for the cold damage, and for the decreased attack speed, and the decreased offensive ability. Also, the fact that they move slower means you get to keep up with them faster. If they're running away, some enemies do. It's a pain in the neck. So you have that option as well. It is not my favorite way to build this. I've covered the Spin to Win before, and this isn't my favorite way of running Spin to Win, but it is possible to make this work, and quite decently well. It is just pretty higher risk overall, though. Is really the main downside here. Also, your damage is a little bit more dispersed, which Spin to Win does kind of want, but you don't really have a whole lot of other options here. So those are the broad strokes of the elemental runs here. Again, if you're running a shield, you can run Virus Might if you intend on taking the Dervish into the Shattered Realm. Virus Might if you're using a shield, Shadow Strike if you're not, basically. Generally speaking, unless you're building a build that specifically uses ranged weapons, in which case that's a totally different conversation, but I don't usually build ranged weapons with the Dervish because I'm too busy having fun with melee. I'm going to be really honest. Melee is way more fun with this class. But besides that, that's overall what you're really going to be talking about here. So there is that. You do have these options. Now, you could go into Guardians of Empyrean. They do decrease physical and bleeding resistance, which is nice. There is actually kind of a bleeding quasi-focus here. You can run, specifically, actually, you can run this, and this gets a little bit interesting. Now, see, I actually want to talk about this for a hot second. You can build the regular Guardians of Empyrean, get that bleeding resistance in there. These are particularly effective if you're running the elemental dual wielding, right? Which I actually didn't talk about enough. So you have, when you're running elemental, you've got another option. You can run the full dual blades plus Righteous Fervor, Guardian of Empyrean, Celestial Presence. This isn't necessary, this is a nice bonus, but by no means should you feel obligated to run this. The nice thing about the Guardians of Empyrean is that they're not pets. They are not pets, they don't count as pets, they don't get any kind of pet boosts. They just exist and inflict pain. Which is great, because the Nightblade has 0 pet interaction. So this is actually a really good thing for the Dervish. But, besides that, they are nice to have, but by no means should you feel obligated to get them. All you really need to make a dual-wielding elemental build work that's focused purely on damage is Righteous Fervor all the way maxed, whack, put as many points as you can in this whole thing as much as you can, go into Pneumatic Burst, maybe you want to go into Merciless Repertoire, I don't usually, but you can. You could go into Phantasmal Armor for your remaining points, that's, tasty or whatever. Go into Amros's Blade Burst if you really want, because, in all honesty, you can run a very impressive... I just want to put all the points in here, because a lot of people overestimate how many points the dual-wielding complete set takes. So you just run this. Actually, technically, you don't even need Divine Mandate if you really don't want it. It's another one of those things that's a nice to have, but this is actually one of the few builds where I will say, yeah, maybe you don't necessarily need an exclusive skill. But you actually can run this whole thing, and then you have a couple of extra points. I usually put them in Phantasmal Armor, but sometimes I'll put them in something else. Maybe I'll put them in Amoros's Burst. This does have a bit of a problem with groups, a couple of points in Resilience. It does have a little bit of a problem with enemy groups. Again, you can pull points out of Divine Mandate. It's a nice to have. It can boost your damage a lot, but it's not strictly necessary if you instead wanted to go into Amoros's Blade Burst for the AoE. You really are worried about enemy groups killing you, put a couple of extra points in Resilience. It still can work really well. Just don't feel obligated to necessarily go into Divine Mandate. Is it powerful? Yes. Will it increase your damage by an impressive amount? Yes, it will. Do you need it to achieve victory? No. No, you don't. Not with a melee dual-wielding elemental build. Alright? But I just wanted to illustrate that you can pour all of those points into the dual wielding and still come out with a lot of points left over for you to splash into whatever. Again, I run Elemental Awakening because it's going to boost all of your damage across the board. It's going to boost the fire damage out of Righteous Fervor. It's going to boost the cold damage out of your dual blades. But you could just go with straight up Pneumatic Burst here. You almost always want at least Pneumatic Burst if you're using the dual wielding, because this just increases your triggers of your various abilities up here. So, in that regard, and also with this particular build, it decreases the amount of time that it takes to fully charge Righteous Fervor, which is always a good thing. The rest of these are bonuses, particularly if you're playing solo. I find Shadow Dance very important in solo gameplay. With allies, maybe it's not so necessary. You've got allies that can maybe increase your elemental resistance more than Elemental Awakening would, but I'm very fond of Elemental Awakening on the chances that I can use it. It is quite nice. But you do have all of these various options for an Elemental Dervish alone. That doesn't even cover a couple of other options, but my favorite way to run Guardian of Empyrean, if I'm going to at all, is absolutely as Scion of Dreeks, because you can run Poison, Acid, Vitality. It's delicious. You can, and at this point, you're basically free reign to do whatever. Alright? You have a bunch of options. You could go into Path of the Three. I don't necessarily always feel the need to go into this. It really depends on my items primarily. Path of the Three is the one exclusive skill I often don't feel a need for if I'm running that particular damage style, because it's not necessarily, I don't often necessarily pull out the damage conversion on this, so it really depends on how you feel like building, but you absolutely can benefit from Path of the Three here. It is, again, very strong, as most exclusive skills are. And at this point, again, if you're going into the shield, Aegis of Thorns, more of that tankier feel. You go into Merciless Repertoire, you go into Amarasta's Blade Burst for that melee situation, right? Maybe you go into Shadow Strike, which is fairly nice. Probably not all the way to Nightfall, because that's Nightmare and point management, but you could. I don't often use Shadow Strike here. But you know, you get your Merciless Repertoire, Amarasta's Blade Burst, Poison, and Cold damage. You've got your acid damage here as well. Great. Or you can go again into the good old-fashioned autofocus. Basically, it's the same as the last one we just talked about. You just have Dreeg's Reproach instead. And instead of necessarily needing Elemental Awakening, because your focus is away from the elements, you actually can take these points out and put them into Amarasta's Blade Burst and max this out over here. And of course, Merciless Repertoire. And then over here, you don't even necessarily need these. Again, this is just a nice to have, but you don't need this at all. You can go into Resilience, you can go into Pneumatic Burst, and just have an absolute grand old time with this. But that's usually, if I'm going to run the Guardians of Empyrean, I am usually going to go into that Poison and Vitality build, because I can also, if I really wanted to, use a skill focus rather than the auto focus. Instead of running Righteous Fervor and the dual wielding, you run Amarasta's Blade Burst, you run Phantasmal Blades, go ahead and make them Frenetic Throw, go all the way over here, and then Ring of Steel for when they close in and they start bashing you in the face. Oh look, now I've got an answer to absolutely everything that you're throwing at me. Oh, you're ranged? Let me just spam Phantasmal Blades at you until you die. Ah, you're closing the distance? Alright, I'm going to freeze you with Amarasta's Blade Burst and then finish you off with a swift Circle of Slaughter as my Scions of Dreeg are slapping you down and removing your resistances. Because this actually can be a pretty decent drop in resistances. That's 25 stinking %. That is a pretty impressive drop. So, you know, this is quite the point investment for just those two, but I mean, you don't really necessarily, what is that doing over there? You don't necessarily need this maxed either, because unless you're going into Execution or for some reason Blade Spirit, it's not necessary. Blade Spirit can be very nice. Actually, what's a fairly fascinating point that I like to make every once in a blue moon, whenever the Dervish comes up, is that you basically can really spam a whole bunch of invincible not pets. You've got 2 Blade Spirits here. You've got 2 Guardians of Empyrean you can have here. It's just absolutely insane. And they're invincible. They don't go away. They don't have a time limit. They just mow things down. It's kind of funny running around with invincible not pets. It's not what I would necessarily call supremely effective, because that is a huge point drain. You're putting 100 points to max out both of these. You've got 16 here, you've got 12 here. That is a grand whopping total of 28. You don't even necessarily need Path of the 3 here for this necessarily, or Scion of Dreeg. But just using these two, that's 28 there, so now you're down 128. And then you've got 16 here, so now you're down 144. Yeah, and that is a lot of points for 4 immortal not pets. And then at that point you're like, well, now what am I going to do? Like, you just don't have... Observe. The dual wielding takes about as much points, but you're boosting yourself at the same time. You're going to have just over 100 points, which sounds like a lot. But then you kind of realize, alright, so maybe I go into these, alright? Maybe I want to do that Poison, Acid, Vitality. Alright, let's die on this hill. We'll just increase Pneumatic Burst, don't care about anything else. We go into Heartseeker. Go into Nether Edge. And then, let me see. What else we got here? Let's go into Ring of Steel. for the melee. Alright, great. Nope, not Phantasmal Armor. We're going to do Resilience. Notice that after all is said and done, we have 2 skills. I mean, it barely... It's very close. I could have gone into Amaras's Blade Burst instead just as easily. I just find Ring of Steel a little bit more effective, personally, when you're using the Scions of Dreeg. Obviously, if we didn't want to do that, we could go out of... We could pull that out. We can use Divine Mandate instead. We could then go into some more elemental damage, pull these out, and take all these points out, and instead we go into Amaras's Blade Burst, go very skill heavy. It's just a lot of point investment into basically stats down here in the mastery bar, which isn't necessarily ideal. I'll often pick one of the 2 invincible not pets and stick with that, and it's up to your choice. I usually use the Guardians of Empyrean because at the very least they do decrease enemy resistances, which can be quite powerful. I don't usually go for the Blade Spirit. You'll notice that I don't recommend the Blade Spirit a lot. It is nice, it's a nice to have. It can do incredibly large amounts of damage if you build correctly. The problem is it's a lot of point investment for something that's basically operating independently of you. And even though it's getting the same benefits from your equipment that you are, at the end of the day, at least for the Dervish, the Guardians of Empyrean are reducing enemy resistances to something. And the Whirling Blades don't do that. And that's my main issue with them. They don't do anything specifically for you. They're just floating around doing extra damage. And you have no control over them, so you can't direct them. It's very hit or miss. At the very least, the Guardians of Empyrean, they're going to go up there. Even if they're attacking something that you don't need attacked right now, they're reducing its resistances, and you can do some collateral damage with an AoE ability or a ranged ability or something. Frenetic Throw, or Amaras's Blade Burst, or Throne Shield, what have you. Whatever you're using, you can collateral off of them and be able to take advantage of even their silliness. Even their silliest moments you can take advantage of, but you can't do that with the Whirling Blades. So, broadly speaking, that's a lot of the Dervish. Now, again, I mentioned that there is the kind of vitality type thing. That would be more along the lines of Phantasmal Blades. There's also the famous Poison Acid version, where, again, you're running, as I mentioned before, you can run the Poison Acid version of the dual wielding setup here, but you could also go into Amaras's Blade Burst, Night's Chill here, and then run Merciless Repertoire, and at this point you can still run the Righteous Fervor there, go for Consecration, Delightful Retribution, you know, just have a field day. But there's a couple of different ways you can approach this, but there's no... The Dervish is a bit interesting. Technically, there's no wrong way of building this. Well, there's the only wrong way to build the Dervish is by trying to diversify your damage too much. By picking one specific focus, you're automatically going to incorporate damage types different enough that you're not going to really have a huge problem with anything resistant to your particular damage type. Your only mistake is being wishy-washy, basically. If you're going to do elemental damage with your Dervish, really focus in on that. Don't slap in Dreeg's Reproach if you're doing elemental damage just because you don't want to do too much fire damage. That's nonsense. If you're going to pick one of these broad build styles, die on that hill. Because you can make that build work. You can make that damage type work. You can make that idea work. But the instant you try to combine the two broad spectrums, you're shooting yourself in the foot because you're diversifying your damage too much. You're trying to even out all your damage, and you're going to be hitting like a wet noodle to everything because they're going to resist one or the other of your damage types, and the rest of them aren't going to have been buffed enough to do anything real. So, really the only mistake you can make with the Dervish is by being indecisive. Say to yourself, alright, I really want to do, say, vitality damage. Okay, how do I want to do it? Hey, I can go vitality with Dreeg's Reproach. Now I can bust out some dual wielding. Alright, we're going to do that dual wielding. Fantastic. What else do I need? Self-heal, Mimetic Burst. Great. Vitality damage? Okay, we can grab Anatomy of Murder. We have vitality damage here. We've got bleeding. We've got bleeding right here. I've got vitality damage here. Grab Consecration because, hey, I like that elemental resistance. I like that attack speed. Great. Do I need Retribution? Am I doing anything with that internal trauma damage? No, I'm not. Alright, we're going to leave that alone. We're going to look at this. Okay, we've got some cold and vitality. Do I want Merciless Repertoire? Nah, it's not really what I'm focusing on. Get that out of here. But we could still. Potential. But we're not doing retaliation damage, so no. I mean, either way you can do this, but again, this really depends on how far out a field of that vitality damage you're doing. At this point now, you're focusing more on poison acid damage, which still works. But now your items might change a little bit. You might want to be wielding different weapons. Maybe. It really depends. And a lot of what you want to build with this is going to come down to your equipment. Because you're probably, when I first said you don't want to be wishy-washy, you were probably thinking to yourself, Professor, come on. I can see all these combinations working out. And you're right. Right here, right now, on paper, so to speak, the connections are, now that, once they're spoken out loud, they're very obvious. But once you get into the game and you pick up, oh, that's a really cool piece of equipment, but it doesn't match my damage type. I've been doing an Elemental Dervish. This piece of equipment does poison, acid, and vitality, and it's for Dervish. And you're going to be tempted. Hey, I could splash in a little bit of damage. I could splash this here. Don't splash. Don't do it. That is where you will cripple yourself. If you have equipment for the Dervish and you want to use it, great. Dedicate yourself to at least that rough idea. I'm not saying you necessarily have to plan out point by point by point, but if you have an idea in your head, whether it's inspired by a piece of equipment or not, and again, I'll be covering equipment sets for the Dervish later on, but if you have a piece of equipment and you're like, this looks really cool, I want to use this, okay. Use that as your building blocks for a build. This item for this Dervish is doing poison, acid, damage. Alright, that's great. Do poison, acid damage. Splash in some cold damage as your sub-damage type. Really dedicate yourself. If you're going with a poison, acid, you've got two poison, acid weapons that you want to dual wield, great. Merciless Repertoire. Go with maxing out all of these. Splash in Delicious Pneumatic Burst. Alright. Dreeg's Reproach. Fantastic. Okay. Now you stop. Hold on a second. Before you get crazy. Okay. Now what do I want to do? You may be tempted. Hey. Phantasmal Blades. Eh? But that's piercing damage. That's some bleeding damage that you're not increasing. Yes, it'll eventually go to vitality damage. You could get Frenetic Throw and do vitality damage. But at the end of the day, you're still diversifying away from that poison acid. You already have some vitality damage to help you out against poison acid resistant enemies. You've already got bleeding going on here that you can rely on. You've got piercing, you've got regular weapon damage. You're now starting to do almost equal amounts of poison acid and vitality damage or pierce damage using Phantasmal Blades. Consider, in this rare instance, Shadow Strike, piercing cold damage. Alright. You're already increasing the cold damage from Merciless Repertoire, so that fits in. Okay. Poison Acid. Alright, good. Second, lower recharge. Do I want to go into Nightfall? Well, maybe. You've got some increased cold damage, you've got some increased vitality damage. This then becomes a matter of opinion. You don't need this. It's nice to have, but you don't need it. It really depends on what you're going with, but that, up to all its justifiable ends, that's a pretty good time. Just keep in mind when you're going through the Dervish, and you're picking up equipment, and you're looking at it, and you're thinking to yourself, that's cool. Ask yourself, does this fit with what I was already doing? If no, ask yourself the question, do I want to change my damage focus to incorporate this? If that piece of equipment is not level 90 plus, it's not worth it. I can understand if you picked up your first really cool piece of equipment for Dervish, and it's a completely different damage, I would say, damage paradigm. You were doing an elemental Dervish until you picked up this incredibly cool piece of equipment that is also for Dervish but does poison acid damage. It's level 94, and you're like, ooh, this is cool. Do I convert over? Sure, it's level 94. You can absolutely rework. You just have to be very careful about when you do it. If you are going to do that switch, make sure you have other pieces of equipment that actually support that. You know, if you're dual wielding a cold and a fire damage weapon, and you bring in and you pick up a poison acid weapon that could work with the poison acid build, and it's your only poison acid damage increase on all of your equipment, even if you want to change to that, wait until you have a couple of more pieces, forge them, buy them, pick them up off of the dead crushed enemies of your foes, the dead crushed bodies of your foes. Pardon me, English. I speak it. I swear. Get some more equipment as backup. Don't just, oh, I've got this one piece, let me convert. That's not going to work, because it's going to be the only piece of equipment boosting you, and you're going to, in total, weaken yourself. Now, this sounds like common sense to a lot of people, but for a lot of the classes, there is much less risk here. The Nightblade is just got so much going on that this is just a higher risk with anything Nightblade related, primarily. You'll notice that a lot of the builds that I've talked about, they've kind of got some overlap here, where, for example, let's take an example here. Soldier and, let's say Soldier and Oathkeeper, alright? Let's take that as an example. Soldier does physical internal trauma, the occasional piercing, bleeding, but not really a whole lot, but primarily physical and internal trauma. Oathkeeper does fire, physical, and internal trauma. You were working on a fire Oathkeeper soldier. I can't remember the combination's name off the top of my head for some reason. But you were working on a fire version of that. Oh, I picked up this piece of equipment. Oh, it increases physical damage. I got to convert over to fire. That's not a huge leap for the Oathkeeper. If you were using Divine Mandate as your exclusive skill, you're increasing physical and internal trauma already, with a bonus of fire. So that's a very easy conversion. Maybe you change Fire's Might for Shield, the soldier's version of the dash. I can't remember its name off the top of my head. I'm having a brain cramp right now. But say, you convert Fire's Might to the other one. The Oathkeeper dash for the soldier one, for the increased physical damage. I mean, it's not a huge leap there. But with Nightblade, a lot of these are big leaps. For Oathkeeper, for the Dervish, you're looking at either a broadly elemental or a broadly vitality poison. And the only real connection there is cold damage, which you can use as a kind of bridge. So if you're looking to build a Dervish, cold damage is pretty much the only mainstay you'll have. Regardless of which one of these two builds you're running, cold damage will always be there. So try and give some slight priority to equipment that boosts cold damage, because if you ever feel like converting from elemental to poison acid or vitality, or vice versa, cold damage is probably going to be there. The only exception to this is vitality. Vitality is a bit risky because that doesn't actually have any direct interaction with cold damage. Because really, when you're doing a vitality dervish, you're running Anatomy of Murder. You're probably running Phantasmal Blades with Frenetic Throw. Maybe you're running Ring of Steel and Circle Slaughter, maybe you're not. Even if you're running Path of the Three, you're probably running either Righteous Fervor with Rodrigue's Reproach, which still doesn't do cold damage, or have any interaction with it. Or you're running Aegis of Thorns, because you're not dual wielding at all. And you don't necessarily, because there's a little bit of bleed damage, but that's not necessarily going to be enough to get you there, but you could. But it's a little bit harder to convert from Vitality to Elemental and vice versa. But beyond that, one exception, cold damage is going to be something you want to slightly prioritize, because that's going to transfer very cleanly from one to the other. In case you're in the middle of building, or you're not sure what you want to build, and you're kind of experimenting, hey, how do I want to play this? Cold damage is something you should really look at as being even if it's not going to wind up being the focal damage, it's going to be the bridge between two different builds. But Vitality is, like I said, going to be a slowdown. But I hope this helped you. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you did not, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. I love to read them. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.